Welcome to our channel, where real stories come to life with heart depth and meaning. Thank you for clicking on this video and spending your time with us. I invite you to stay until the very end, because today's story isn't just emotional. It might just change the way you think about love, family, and what it means to truly belong. Trust me, you won't want to miss a single moment. They say Jackson Hole is where the mountains meet money, where luxury wears hiking boots and old wealth flies in on private jets just to breathe the thin, expensive air. The Cooper family comes here every summer. It's tradition. One of those long-standing, unstated rituals the East Coast elite keep like heirlooms, passed down not for meaning, but for the way they reinforce who belongs and who doesn't. And I don't. Not really. My name is Olivia Martin. I'm 36. I build transportation infrastructure for the U.S. Department of Transportation. Federal contracts. Multi-billion-dollar corridors. But here tonight at this table, draped in Belgian linen and surrounded by crystal stemware, I'm the one people hand their empty wine glasses to, mistaking me for a staff member. Again. Olivia. Darling, Judith says with a tight smile that doesn't reach her eyes. I think the arugula salad is missing the vinaigrette. Could you be a dear? I nod, wordless, weightless, and step away from the dining veranda toward the catering station, not because I forgot the vinaigrette. I didn't. But because in this family, silence is easier than confrontation. Judith Cooper is the kind of woman who could lace poison through praise. Her hair is always perfect. Her pearls are real. Her judgments subtle, as they are cut cleaner than knives. The rest of them, the Coopers, the Sutters, the Lehmans, laugh over oysters and imported rosé like it's a competition. One sister-in-law talks about her recent art auction in Tribeca. Another compares elite preschool tuition rates like it's casual conversation. They are the kind of people who see expensive as synonymous with correct. I'm standing beside a 3-tiered salad tray when I hear someone ask Olivia, "You're in tech, right? Or was it something with software?" The question hangs in the air like steam off a dish you didn't order. I'm in infrastructure, I reply gently, knowing they won't remember. Andrew, my husband, sits across the table listening, but not hearing. He's telling his cousin about his latest philosophy lecture at Columbia, hands gesturing mid-thought, like punctuation marks. He's good at ideas, terrible at noticing moments that need his voice. I've been married into this family for 11 years. 11 summers in these same lodges, same white chairs with navy cushions, same Welcome Back Coopers sign painted by the staff who were told to act like it was a surprise. I've smiled through their jokes about my sensible shoes. I've watched them raise glasses to each other's promotions, never once asking what I've built, what I've sacrificed, what I've survived, and I have survived. I was raised in a rented duplex in Springfield, Oregon, the daughter of a single mother who cleaned roadside motels for 16 years. I got into MIT because I worked harder than anyone else. I graduated top of my class because I refused to believe I didn't belong there. I built my own name brick by brick before I ever took on my husband's. But none of that ever made it into their conversations. To them, I'm just Olivia. The quiet one, the polite one. The one who always knows when the napkins need refolding. This isn't about hate. I wish it were that simple. It's about omission. The kind that erodes you not in big blows, but in the way erosion works along a cliff, subtle, relentless, almost invisible. It's Judith asking where I bought my dress and calling it sensible in that tone that implies something just short of approval. It's the way they look past me when I speak, like I'm the lighting in the room, pleasant, functional, and entirely ignorable. The air up here smells like pine needles and quiet judgment. The kind of place where everything is manicured, even the smiles. I watch as Lauren Andrews' younger sister waves over a waiter like she's been doing it since she was 5. "Excuse me, sparkling water." "No ice," she says. Then turns to her mother. "Can you believe last year they tried to serve us tap?" Judith just shakes her head and sighs. Some places forget who built their reputation. I grip the silver salad tongs a little tighter, because I remember. I remember every year at this resort trying a little harder, bringing a dish that no one touched, offering to help with logistics, only to be handed the cleanup, planning Andrew's father's retirement dinner from scratch and not hearing my name once during the thank you speeches. And still I stayed, because somewhere deep inside me, there was a sliver of belief that effort would equal acceptance. But tonight, I feel it like the sharp snap of a cable under pressure. That belief is gone. Not in anger, not in bitterness, but in clarity. I have built bridges that carry millions, highways that unite cities, systems that make entire regions function. And yet here, my greatest accomplishment is being quiet enough not to offend. Not anymore. As I turn back toward the table, Judith catches my eye again, her smile just wide enough to imply kindness. I return it warm, deliberate, unreadable. What they don't know, what they couldn't imagine, is that this is the last summer I play the part, because I didn't come here this time as just Andrew's wife. I came here as the woman who owns the land their tradition is built on. And they're about to find out. I come from a place that doesn't show up on postcards. Springfield, Oregon, just east of Eugene off the I-5 corridor. A town of rain-slicked sidewalks, chain-link fences, and the kind of modest homes where dreams grow slowly, if at all. We lived in a duplex behind a shuttered gas station. Our curtains were made from old bed sheets, and the wallpaper peeled in corners like it was trying to escape. My mother, Teresa Martine, was the kind of woman who never complained, never rested, and never let me forget where we stood in this world. She was born in El Paso, crossed into Oregon as a teenager, and never left. She worked at a budget roadside inn room, 102 to 138, scrubbed with bleach and dignity. 16 years of bed sheets, soap scum, and silence. She used to hum when she cleaned. That was her armor, a tune against invisibility. She raised me with one hand holding a mop and the other on my back pushing me forward. "Don't let this be all you know," she'd whisper as she braided my hair before school. "Be smarter than the job, smarter than the street, but never, never think you're better than people." By the time I was 12, I could fix a leaky faucet and rewire a lamp. By 14, I had memorized the bus routes to the library 2 towns over, where I read about the Hoover Dam NASA propulsion systems and the miracle of a well-designed overpass. Engineering wasn't just numbers to me. It was proof that systems, when done right, hold the weight of the world without collapsing. I got into MIT on a full ride. No one in our neighborhood had ever made it out that far. I remember my mother's hands shaking as she held the acceptance letter, her calloused thumbs smudging the ink like it might disappear. Cambridge was another planet. Everything smelled like privileged leather satchels, espresso, the crisp starch of generational wealth. I showed up with a suitcase that didn't match and a deep fear I'd be found out. I was one of the only Latinas in my program, one of the only women. I didn't drink wine. I didn't know what a gap year was. I worked 2 campus jobs and still couldn't afford a new winter coat. But I kept my head down. I learned to be quiet in rooms that had never heard my voice before. I met Andrew Cooper during a shared lecture in ethical philosophy. He was quoting Camus and taking notes with a fountain pen. I was eating a protein bar I had bought with meal vouchers. He was kind in the gentle, wide-eyed way of people who've never had to fight for anything. We started talking after class, debating Plato versus pragmatism, his world light years from mine. He was raised in New Canaan, Connecticut. His father had a trust fund. His mother played violin at charity galas. Andrew wore cardigans, read Murakami, and once asked if my name had an accent mark in it, like it was poetry. I should have seen it then, the way he viewed my background as refreshingly grounded, a character trait, not a history. Still I fell. Not because I needed rescue, but because it felt like someone had finally slowed down long enough to listen. We got married 3 years after graduation in a vineyard in the Hudson Valley. Judith, his mother, wore Chanel and greeted my mother with a nod so faint it could have been a neck cramp. During her toast, she introduced me as the little engineer from the West Coast, smiling like she was including me in something sacred. I remember how her voice skipped over my last name like a stone on water, never quite touching the surface. I tried, God, I tried. That first Thanksgiving, I roasted 2 turkeys, one traditional, one adobo style in tribute to my roots. No one touched the second one. Judith made a comment about unusual spices while dabbing the corners of her mouth with a monogrammed napkin. I brought holiday gifts tailored to each person's interest. Books for Andrew's father, gourmet tea for Lauren, a baby onesie for the newborn cousin. But at the family exchange, I got a candle from Home Goods, with the price tag still on it. I learned to mimic their mannerisms, held my wine glass by the stem, crossed my legs at the ankle, nodded with half smiles during their stock market conversations. I learned to laugh without revealing too much. I learned that belonging wasn't about effort. It was about pedigree. And I didn't have it. But I didn't stop trying. I offered to help coordinate their summer retreats, manage spreadsheets and itineraries like a second job, stayed up late booking transport and researching restaurants. At the end of one vacation, Andrew's cousin toasted the incredible planning and thanked Judith for organizing everything. Judith smiled like she deserved it. Andrew squeezed my hand under the table. "They don't mean to forget," he whispered. I smiled back. But inside I felt it something slipping loose. The quiet knowing that I could build bridges across oceans and still be invisible in my own marriage. How did I get here? Not by accident. By surviving long enough to see how much they never saw me. And someday, I promised myself, someday I would no longer be the footnote in their family stories. I'd be the author. It happened last summer. The kind of moment that doesn't arrive with thunder or drama, but slips in quietly like a splinter under the skin. Barely visible. Impossible to ignore. We were gathered on the terrace of the main lodge, overlooking the lake at dusk. That golden hour light, soft and cinematic, washed everything in amber, except the words. Andrew's Uncle Richard was halfway through his second gin and tonic, his voice louder now than his sense of tact. He was talking about the new monorail project I'd just helped break ground on in Seattle federal funding complex architecture, a technical triumph by any standard. But to him, it was cocktail fodder. "Well, would you look at that?" he chuckled, pointing his glass in my direction. Who would have thought someone without a silver spoon could actually master complex engineering? "That's impressive, Olivia. Really very handy for a girl from modest stock." He said it like a compliment, the way someone compliments a dog for doing a trick. The laughter that followed wasn't cruel. It was worse, it was casual, automatic, the kind that tells you no one realized a line had been crossed. Andrew gave a polite laugh too, then looked at me searching for complicity in my smile. I gave him one, a soft, practiced curve of the lips I'd perfected over the years, one that said I'm fine while something inside me was quietly cracking apart. That night I couldn't sleep. The lodge walls were thin, and voices carried easily through the old wood and stone. I was brushing my teeth when I heard Judith's voice through the vent. She was on the phone low but clear, probably talking to a friend from back east. "She's sweet," she said with the kind of inflection that almost sounded like affection. "But she'll never be one of us. You can just tell. The way she dresses, the way she tries. Bless her heart." I stood there, toothbrush still in hand foam on my lip, as the words dropped like cold stones into my chest. I didn't cry. That was new. I had cried the first few years. In bathrooms, in parked cars, in hotel hallways, with the "Do Not Disturb" sign flipped backward. I had cried quietly, carefully, because I thought if I just tried harder, I could become someone they didn't look through. But that night, I didn't cry. I wiped my mouth, walked into the dark, and sat down at the small wooden desk near the window. The lodge lights outside had gone dim, and the lake reflected the moon in pieces, fractured, but still there. I opened my laptop and stared at the blinking cursor. Then I started typing. To Emily, hart@ashwoodcapital.com. Subject, Re. Follow up on boutique hospitality investment opportunities. Hi, Emily. It's been a while. I hope you're well. I know we spoke briefly last year about the possibility of investing in a hospitality property. If you're still open to a conversation, I'd like to talk. Timing is right. Best, Olivia Martin. I stared at the screen for a long time before hitting send. It wasn't rage that moved me. It wasn't revenge. It was resolve, a shift in the tectonic plates of my patience. I couldn't make them see me. Not really. But I could build something so undeniable their vision would no longer matter. I closed the laptop and stood at the window watching as the lights along the dock flickered off one by one. The lake returned to stillness, and for the first time in years, so did I. The next morning, I woke before dawn, went for a long walk along the wooded trail behind the resort, and drafted a list of criteria, location, property class, value-add potential staff, retention metrics. I wasn't thinking like a guest anymore. I was thinking like an owner. Because here's what most people don't understand about being underestimated. It's not always a curse. Sometimes it's camouflage. And if you know how to move quietly enough, long enough, you can build a kingdom right beneath their feet. That was the moment I stopped trying to earn a seat at their table. I was going to buy the whole damn house. No announcement, no fireworks. Just the slow, methodical climb of someone who knows the terrain. Emily responded the next day. We scheduled a call for that Monday. I kept the email buried in a discreet folder on my desktop, named after a consulting project I knew Andrew wouldn't ask about. He never did. He rarely asked about my late nights, my spreadsheets, my travel. In his world, I was competent, sure, but not dangerous, not ambitious, just helpful. And that made it easier. That entire summer, I began mapping not just properties, but a plan. I studied cash flows, operator histories, legacy guest lists, tax liens. I ran models in silence, negotiated on coffee breaks, held Zoom calls in parked rental cars behind grocery stores. I smiled through dinners with the Coopers, laughed at their jokes, offered to refill their wine. They never saw it coming, because they never thought I could, because I didn't look the part, because I came from a woman who scrubbed baseboards, not from a family with a coat of arms. And so they kept talking, they kept laughing, and I kept building. There's a certain kind of freedom in being underestimated. When no one's watching, you're free to move without resistance, to plant, to build, to shift the ground beneath their feet and smile while they steady themselves, still thinking the world works as it always has. That's how the next 12 months unfolded. Quietly, strategically. Not in explosions, but in excavations. Late nights, long emails, 100 tabs open, and not one of them noticed. I became someone else in the margins of my own life. Olivia Martin, wife of Andrew Cooper by title, but offstage something different entirely. At dinner, I was the one passing salt and nodding politely through conversations about hedge funds and ski passes. But once the dishes were cleared and the house went still, I opened my laptop and transformed into something far more dangerous than they'd ever imagined, a woman with a plan and no need for permission. Sierra Pines Ventures wasn't born out of revenge. It was born out of control. A holding company, clean, discreet, incorporated in Delaware with a registered agent no one in my circle had ever heard of. Through it, I began acquiring equity in mid-sized hospitality properties, places with high foot traffic, underused potential, and legacy problems I knew how to fix. It started small, 2 boutique inns in Colorado, then a lodge in Utah, then a whisper of an opportunity, the one I'd been waiting for. The Cooper family's beloved summer resort. I'd memorized it over a decade, its rhythms, its staff, its floor plans. I knew where the AC sputtered in cabin 12, where the wine cellar always ran low by mid-August, where Judith liked to sit each morning with her imported Darjeeling. It was familiar terrain, and it was broken enough for a buyer to step in if she knew what to say. I made my offer through Sierra Pines and 3 layers of negotiation agents. By the time the documents were signed, I held 82% controlling interest. And no one, absolutely no one, traced it back to me. That was the point. I didn't want fanfare. I wanted leverage. I retained the existing general manager, Ethan, a thoughtful man with a backbone and a notebook. I sat down with him on Zoom one October evening, camera off, voice low. I told him we'd rebuild quietly. No sudden changes, just structural improvements and employee-first policies. I wanted a place that worked better from the inside out. not just for guests, but for the people who'd been ignored far too long. We raised wages across departments, gave health benefits to part-time staff, replaced aging heating systems, installed new guest service software, improved the staff housing. No press releases, no ribbon cuttings. We just made it better. That winter, while the Coopers drank spiced cider in Connecticut and posted holiday photos beside golden retrievers in matching scarves, I was reviewing blueprints, zoning permits, and construction contracts. I spent New Year's Eve in a hotel room in Park City, finalizing the financing terms for a lakeside renovation that would double the resort's waterfront capacity. Andrew didn't ask where I was. He never did. He assumed I was working on a transportation proposal, or maybe visiting my mother. He asked less and less over the years, as if every question might reveal how little he truly understood me. We lived in the same house, shared the same bed, but moved in parallel, never intersecting. He once told me he loved how self-sufficient I was. What he meant was I required no tending, no interruption. I stopped waiting for him to see. Because in truth, people don't question what they don't think is significant, and in their world, I was always pleasant background, like elevator music, like soft wallpaper, useful, forgettable. But while they looked past me, I looked deeper into every detail of the resort they adored. I knew their favorite rooms. I saw the underpaid staff Judith would scold for wrinkled napkins. I saw the gardeners who got heat stroke fixing her rose trellis. I remembered the teenage girl she once made cry because the dessert tray lacked elegance. I filed it all away. Not out of malice, but for clarity. Because this time, I wouldn't just be part of their vacation story. I would own the setting. By spring, the resort was humming. Staff morale had shifted, guest reviews climbed, the HVAC units purred quietly instead of coughing in corners. The lakefront cabins had filtered water and new mattresses. I had spent a decade being their quiet helper, their reliable outsider. Now I was the reason their favorite summer ritual still functioned. And no one knew. Not Andrew, not Judith, not a single cousin, uncle, or sister-in-law. I wore no title, signed no Christmas card as president or owner. I let them complain about new management over dinner like it was trivia. I even smiled when they said the resort had changed, lost its charm. They had no idea they were dining on ground I had quietly reclaimed. It wasn't revenge. It was reclamation. And soon, they would see it. There are moments in life that do not arrive with a roar, but a hush. The kind of silence that feels alive, heavy, waiting. It was the last evening of the Cooper family's summer retreat, what Judith always referred to as a celebration of continuity. The private dining hall was set with precision tall taper candles, white linen, hand-calligraphed name cards like a wedding. Judith sat at the head of the table, pearls nestled beneath her collarbone like punctuation marks on everything she didn't have to say aloud. The Coopers loved tradition. They loved it more than they loved people. I wore a navy sheath dress from an end-of-season sale and the same nude heels I'd worn to my MIT graduation. They weren't loud, but they were mine. Dinner began with sea bass and small talk. Andrew's cousin Marcus was already halfway through a Bordeaux, older than his marriage, talking about market fluctuations like they were weather reports. The table buzzed with empty opinions and inflated certainty. I sat 2 chairs from the end, sipping still water, listening like a ghost who happened to wear lipstick. Then came the complaints. "The front desk staff has really gone downhill," Lauren said, stabbing her fork into roasted carrots like they'd offended her. I had to show my ID twice at check-in. Haley chimed in, flipping her hair, as if to toss the memory over her shoulder. "It's like they don't recognize returning guests anymore." Uncle Richard leaned back, balancing his wine glass on his gut. "Don't even get me started on the valet. Kid practically accused me of stealing my own car." They laughed, not cruelly, casually, like this place belonged to them. And then Judith leaned forward, resting her hands on the tablecloth in that deliberate way she had when preparing to deliver something memorable. "I just hope she said smoothly, that whoever owns this place now realizes families like ours are the reason it has value. We built this tradition. We gave it soul. Her voice was honey wrapped around acid. I felt my fingers tighten around the stem of my glass. It wasn't the first time she'd claimed ownership of something she didn't build, but it would be the last. I looked across the table past the stemware and silver toward Andrew. He was listening, nodding along, eyes glazed in agreement with a world he'd never had to question. It hit me then, not like a blow, but like a blade slipping between ribs. He would never say my name when it mattered. Not when they mocked me, not when they erased me, and not when they staked claim to something I had quietly, completely made my own. I stood from my chair, excused myself softly, and walked out to the balcony. The night air was cooler than I expected, sharp like clarity. From below, the lake stretched out like a sheet of ink. Still, ominous, reflective. I pulled out my phone and dialed Ethan, the resort's general manager. He picked up on the second ring. "Hey, boss," he said. "You good?" "I'm ready," I whispered. "Announce it. Tonight. Before dessert." There was a pause. "Are you sure?" I looked back through the window. Judith was mid-laugh. Marcus had his phone out, showing off his crypto portfolio. They were perfectly at ease in a space they no longer controlled. "Yes," I said. "Let them sit in it before they applaud." Inside, Ethan stepped up to the front of the room and tapped his glass twice. The sound rang out with ceremonial clarity. "If I could have your attention," he began, voice calm but firm. "I'd like to share something on behalf of Sierra Pines Ventures." The room hushed. For the past year, our resort has undergone a quiet transition. Tonight, we're proud to announce the new majority owner, a woman whose leadership has already transformed the experience you've all enjoyed this week. He turned. "And it is our honor to introduce Ms. Olivia Martin." The silence was instant, dense. It felt like holding breath underwater. Then came the ripple. Judith's wine glass tilted and spilled across the white linen, deep red, blooming like a wound. Lauren's fork clattered to her plate. Marcus whispered, "Wait." Her Andrew turned to me, mouth slightly open, confusion blooming behind his eyes, like storm clouds too late to outrun. I stepped back into the room, heels clicking against the polished wood, every head turned. I walked slowly, deliberately toward the head of the table. Judith's seat. I didn't stop until I stood behind it. I didn't ask for attention. I already had it. I heard I said gently that some of you had feedback. A beat. Then I smiled. I'd be happy to handle it personally. No one moved. No one blinked. It was like watching actors forget their lines on a stage they thought they owned. I let the moment breathe. Then I stepped back, placed my hand on the back of the chair I would never sit in, and added, "You're all welcome to return next year, just like everyone else now. No more legacy bookings, no more discounts, no more inheritance by proximity, only policies, fair ones." I handed the mic to Ethan, nodded once, and walked out of the room as quietly as I had entered. It wasn't triumph I felt. It was release. Like setting down a weight you didn't realize you were carrying until it's gone. For the first time in 11 years, I wasn't shrinking to make them comfortable. I was standing, fully, finally, unapologetically. And they could either adjust their gaze or learn to look away from the sun. 3 days after the dinner, the silence began to break. It started with a text from Lauren. "Hey, can we talk?" I didn't answer. Then came the voice memo, full of vague urgency. Her tone was polished, nervous. "There seems to have been a misunderstanding," she said, using that word 5 times in under 60 seconds. Misunderstanding, as if decades of entitlement were a grammatical error she could revise. But the audit request she received from the state of Wyoming wasn't a misunderstanding. It was the result of a quiet investigation I'd initiated 2 months before the ownership reveal an inquiry into the suspiciously steady stream of off-season guests who rented her family cabin. She'd made over $40,000 in undeclared income, from subletting it under the table, listing it privately to wealthy contacts, and pocketing every cent. I didn't go after the money. I went after the records. We passed them along to the right agency, and I sent her the contact info for a very good CPA. No accusations, just accountability. Her silence after that was louder than any apology. Uncle Mike was next. His lease had technically expired 8 years ago, but he'd been extending it through handshake agreements and paper-thin amendments signed by a former manager. The cabin was perched on prime lakefront property, 3 bedrooms, vaulted ceilings, untouched since 1995, and still billed at grandfathered rates meant for maintenance staff. I didn't revoke it outright. I gave him 30 days to vacate and handed the cabin over to a nonprofit that provides free summer retreats to disabled veterans and their families. Their first group arrived the following July, unloading wheelchairs and coolers with joy so loud it carried across the water. Mike emailed me a week later. No subject line. Just a sentence, "I hope you know what you're doing." I did. I knew exactly what I was doing. Then there was Judith. She showed up unannounced one Tuesday afternoon in August, wearing her good pearls and an expression composed of concern and desperation pressed together like 2 pieces of fine china. She knocked on my office door and I let her in. She sat across from me, legs crossed, back straight, and began with a practiced tone, low, almost maternal. The kind reserved for delicate negotiations and backroom fundraisers. "Olivia," she said, folding her hands like a news anchor. "This doesn't have to be dramatic." I didn't speak. She continued. "We're family. We've had our differences, but I think we both want what's best for everyone." She paused for effect, measured her words like sugar cubes dropped into tea. "Appearances matter, dear. You know that. People watch. They talk. And frankly, this she gestured around the room, around the building. Around everything I now controlled, it's beginning to reflect poorly on all of us, including Andrew." There it was, the pivot. This was never about reconciliation. It was about optics. I opened the drawer beside me and pulled out a manila folder. I had prepared it weeks ago. Not because I wanted to use it, but because I knew one day she'd come looking for mercy without ever offering regret. Inside were 3 printed emails, dated between 2018 and 2022. In them, Judith referred to staff members by name as useless, lazy, mouthy, unfit for public-facing duties. One message to a summer intern read, "Perhaps you'd do better in housekeeping. You're already halfway there." Attached were notarized statements from all 3 former employees. One of them, a housekeeper, still cried when she talked about how Judith had belittled her accent in front of guests. The resort had quietly settled the claims under my ownership. Apologies issued, legal counsel provided. I slid the folder across the desk. Judith's hand hesitated before touching it. "I don't want to humiliate you," I said, voice steady. "But if you ever try to paint yourself as a victim in this, if you go public or try to challenge the ethics of my leadership, I will release every document in this folder." Her lips parted, but no words came. Her hands trembled ever so slightly. Still elegant, still trying to maintain poise in the face of exposure. "I'm not asking for your respect." I added, my eyes locked on hers. "I don't need it." A pause. Then, "But you will stop stepping on me like I'm grass under your heels." She stood up slowly, gathered her bag, and left without another word. Outside, the wind rustled the lodge's flags against a bright, cloudless sky, and for the first time in a decade, I didn't feel small in the shadow of that woman. I felt unmoved. As for Andrew, he never confronted me, not once. He paced quietly for days, slept in the guest room, sat on the porch with a glass of whiskey and his thoughts. I think the shame was less about what I did and more about what he failed to see. When we finally spoke, it wasn't with anger. It was with distance. "I didn't know you were capable of this," he said, more stunned than proud. "I know," I replied. "You never asked." There was nothing left to fight for after that. No sharp words, just air between us too heavy to breathe. He moved out the following month. Quietly. No fanfare. We are not enemies. We are simply no longer partners. And that somehow hurt less than I thought it would, because I didn't just reclaim my time. I reclaimed my name. And in doing so, I rewrote every ending they thought they'd scripted for me. He didn't yell. He didn't beg. When Andrew came to pack his things, he moved through the house like a man rearranging the furniture of his own silence. One duffel bag, 2 suitcases, his books, his favorite cardigan still smelling faintly of cedar. He didn't say much. But then again, he never really had. The night after the reveal, we sat across from each other at the kitchen table. The same table where I used to write reports late into the night while he read Camus and corrected student essays in the margins. The same table where we once planned vacations, where he once kissed my knuckles and told me I made everything feel stable. Now it was just a table between 2 people who had run out of assumptions. He stared at his hands for a long time like they held a secret he'd missed. "I didn't know," he said, finally, "any of it." I nodded. "Exactly." He looked up, searching my face for something familiar. "You didn't tell me." "No," I said gently. "But you also never asked." That landed somewhere between us with a soft final weight. A truth too simple to debate. It wasn't said with anger. Just exhaustion. He had never asked why I worked so late. Never asked what I was building. Never asked what it felt like to sit beside his mother while she dismantled me with pleasantries, or what it cost to keep showing up to rooms that pretended not to see me. Andrew wasn't cruel. That was the hardest part. Cruelty is easier to confront. It has a shape, a sound. But Andrew was kind. He was supportive. He said good luck before big meetings and brought me tea when I had the flu. He kissed my forehead before bed. And yet somehow he lived in a world where I was background, comfort, decoration, a steady hum that didn't ask to be heard. And I let him, for years, because I thought that's what strength looked like, endurance disguised as love. He stood from the table, walked to the doorway, then paused. "Was any of it real?" he asked, almost to himself. "All of it was real," I replied, "but it's over now." He nodded slowly, not in agreement, but in understanding. He didn't fight it. He didn't beg me to stay or ask me to reconsider. Maybe that was his final failure. Or maybe it was mine for expecting a man who had never seen me to suddenly learn how. He moved out quietly the following week. No ceremony, no announcement, just a key left on the counter, and the sound of the front door closing soft as a sigh. I stayed. Not because the house was mine, but because I wasn't finished inhabiting the version of myself that no longer needed to be explained. The truth is, I didn't leave the marriage for revenge. I didn't expose his family to prove a point. I didn't rewrite the rules of the resort to make them suffer. I did it because I had spent years giving pieces of myself away for acceptance that never came, and I was done shrinking to fit inside someone else's legacy. I didn't need a seat at their table. I needed a place in my own life. I started waking earlier, walking the grounds before sunrise with a coffee in one hand and a clipboard in the other. Staff nodded at me with something new in their eyes. Not deference, not fear. Just respect. The quiet kind. The kind I had always given and rarely received. And still some mornings I'd think of Andrew. The way he used to rest his hand on my lower back when we crossed a street, the way he loved poetry, the way he once whispered, "You're the most capable woman I've ever met," without realizing how little he meant it. But memory is not a reason to stay. It's just a reason to walk slower on some days. One evening in September, I found an old photograph tucked inside one of my books, me and Andrew, our wedding day. I was in a borrowed dress laughing at something he'd just said. It was a real laugh. The kind that lifts your whole body. I looked at it for a moment, then I placed it back where I found it. Because not every part of the past needs to be erased. Some things can simply remain as reminders, as evidence that we were once something good, even if we weren't meant to last. I didn't become someone new when he left. I just stopped hiding who I'd been all along. A woman who builds. A woman who sees the cracks before they spread. A woman who doesn't ask to be chosen but chooses herself fully, fiercely, finally. Some people say closure comes with apology. For me, it came with silence. Not the silence of being ignored, but the kind you claim, the kind that leaves room for your own voice to echo back at you and say, "You're enough. You always were." 3 months later, the wind changed. It was the kind of morning that arrived without fanfare, just a softness in the air, like the earth exhaling. The lake was still, a mirror of sky and pine and possibility. From the upper balcony of the lodge, I could see the white tent rising on the lawn below. The folding chairs had been arranged in neat arcs, the podium centered beneath a string of paper lanterns, swaying gently in the breeze. It was opening day. The Teresa Martin Foundation. I named it after my mother not for prestige, but for permanence. For the woman who taught me that dignity is not granted by status, but earned through persistence. That respect begins at the edges of your own reflection. That strength can wear an apron and walk in silence and still shape the world. She never lived to see this place, but her fingerprints are on every stone. The foundation would serve as a community hub, part educational center, part retreat, part promise. We had partnered with 3 regional universities to launch a scholarship program for first-generation Latina women pursuing engineering. There would be mentorship tracks, transportation stipends, stipends for childcare. The goal wasn't just access, it was longevity, sustainability. I wanted to give other young women what I had to fight for, not just a seat in the classroom, but a sense that they belonged there. I walked down the hill, slowly taking it in. The air smelled of pine needles and late summer sunlight. Staff were setting out refreshments. A violinist tuned softly under the tent. It was elegant, but not extravagant. Humble in the way my mother would have approved of thoughtful, functional, and kind. At the ribbon, I paused. The audience was modest. Some community partners, a few journalists, a handful of students and their families. I didn't invite the Coopers, not out of malice, but because this moment wasn't about them. It never had been. I stepped to the podium and cleared my throat. No microphone, no flash. "Good morning," I said, my voice steady in the quiet. "This place is for the women no one saw coming. For the daughters of dishwashers, the nieces of seamstresses, the sisters of field workers. For every girl who had to become her own blueprint because no one left her one." I paused. The only sound was the breeze rustling leaves like applause. "This isn't about charity," I continued. "It's about returning power to the hands it was taken from." My mother cleaned motels for most of her life, and because she did, I learned how to build things that lasted. I didn't cry. Not because I wasn't moved, but because this was joy. Quiet joy, the kind that lives beneath the surface, unshaken by applause. After the ceremony, I stayed behind while the others dispersed. Someone offered to walk me back to the lodge, but I waved them off gently. I needed a moment, alone. I climbed the stairs to the balcony where it all began. The same spot I had stood the night Ethan announced my name as the new owner. Back then I was holding my breath, waiting to see how the world would react to a woman it had spent years ignoring. Now I breathed freely. The lake stretched out below like a silver secret. I sat down, coffee in hand, and let the quiet settle around me. There's something sacred about silence when it's yours. When it's not the silence of being dismissed or talked over, but the silence of knowing you no longer owe anyone an explanation. In the end, I didn't need vindication. I didn't need Judith's respect, or Lauren's apology, or Andrew's recognition. What I needed was this: stillness, a clear morning, the hum of belonging that comes not from being accepted but from no longer asking. Because here's the truth no one tells you. There are things the world will never give you, not because you don't deserve them, but because it never imagined you could claim them. Visibility, authority, peace. For years I mistook endurance for love and visibility for humility. I thought if I gave enough, softened enough, folded enough, they'd make space for me. But space isn't given, It's made. Carved, if necessary, with every late-night email, every breath you don't waste explaining yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you. I didn't win. This wasn't a victory, it was a reclamation. And now the girl who once packed library books into secondhand backpacks, who refilled water glasses at tables that forgot her name, she owns the building. She writes the checks. She decides who sits at the table and what the table even looks like. I took one last sip of coffee, let the breeze lift the hem of my dress, and smiled. Not because anyone was watching, but because for the first time in years, I was finally looking back at myself. And I saw someone whole, uncompromised, unhidden. This is mine now. Not the lodge, not the company. Me.